Castle Street is one of the oldest streets in Reading, being the historic route into the town from the west. In this first photo from 1890, you can see what is now Castle Hill. At this date, the hill doesn't officially start until after Carey Street. The Horse and Jockey pub is on the right-hand side. This was one of the coaching inns that used to pepper the road from London to Bath and Bristol. The pile of building material and rubbish on the right-hand side reminds us of one of the old complaints made about the town by John Mann 100 years earlier. Describing Castle Street in 1810, he said that each house had a pretty little dunghill before it, composed of road dirt, ashes, straw, dung, turnip parings, cabbage leaves, etc. But these last are not so plentiful as might be wished, owing to some all-devouring hogs who are continually plundering these precious compounds of the greater part of their beauty. One of the most prominent buildings in the street is St Mary's Episcopal Church, which was built in 1798 on the site of the county jail, which allegedly housed John Bunyan for a while on account of his illegal preaching. Prior to that, there is evidence that it was a Franciscan friary. Other buildings of note include the Sun Inn, which is one of the oldest coaching inns in the town, and it has remains of Norman architecture in its framework. Lidford House, currently the offices of Rowberry Morris, which was built as an elegant townhouse in the reign of Elizabeth I. And finally, the Castle Street almshouses, built in 1867 as a replacement for the earlier Thomas Vatchell almshouses, which were constructed in 1634. Here we are looking down Castle Street in 1910, with the tram lines and overhead wires showing a change in transportation. The trams led to more housing development in the suburbs, with many wealthier families moving out. Castle Street was still a moderately thriving shopping area though, and it stayed like this right up until the 1960s. Here's an aerial shot from about 1925, with Castle Street to the left and Bowsier Square ringed. The square was located between Coley Place at the bottom of the circle and Coley Street at the top of the circle. Bowsier Square was one of the areas of poor quality housing built in the mid-1800s, which housed the growing industrial workforce of Reading. This lithograph by Cyril Pearce was produced in the 1920s and shows the adjoining Coley Steps, renowned as the core of Old Coley. All the courts of the steps and Bowsier Square were demolished in the 1930s, although the area continued as a playground for local kids into the 1960s. This photo takes us forward in time to the present day. It's a shot from Google Earth, and it shows the area that was Bowsier Square, circled, and the Coley Steps running down to the right of the footbridge over the IDR.
The tour now moves forward in time to the 1940s and up to the present day, with this video clip of Castle Street. Sadly, times have changed and we have lost all the old buildings from the Sun Inn to the Castle Tap on the north side of the street. We see here 3 Dutch houses built at the turn of the 20th century and paramount in pictures of this area and for anyone who worked and lived there. The camera now swings round to the existing building, standing on the same site as the car dealership of Vincent's after it was demolished. But let's go back to the early 80s with these next photos of the site. We can now see the back entrance to the showroom and the parts department of the garage just before the closure. We now move on to this photo, which shows the side view of the car showroom and of the 3 parked vehicles in the picture, the Red Morris Marina was mine. The final view of the car park shows Castle Street in the background and the remnants of the parts manager's office, Mr. Tony Booth. And I was one of the last people to see the end of the complex before the bulldozers moved in. This picture shows the staff of Vincent's and Morris garages combined, just before the closure. The people in the picture from left to right are Norman Sebich, Stan Johnson, Howard Taylor, Barry Gollop, Nobby Evans, Bob Fowler, Derek Miles and myself, Graham Turner. During the war, Nobby Evans served in the Tank Corps in Africa as an engineer, repairing armoured vehicles, and his regiment was referred to as the Desert Rats. This video was taken from the north side of Castle Street, showing the junction of Coley Place as it is now. But let's go back to 1983 with this photo showing the front entrance to the service department of the car dealership. If you look up Castle Street from the roundabout on top of the IDR, you'll see this. But going back to the shutdown of the garage, we can see the front of the showrooms and the parts department. We now look down Castle Street towards the town. You can see Phoebe Custon's house, which is the pink building on the right, and after that the almshouses with Tunbridge Jones selling soft drinks in the background. I would now like to pass the narration over to the voice of the late Doug Noyes for his description and photos of the rest of Castle Street.
This was beside the pub. Their main building is hidden behind White's taxi garage. Next door to White's is Hutchinson's, the tobacconist, and then Lyne's, the confectioner's. I think Mrs. Lyne moved up to Wednesday Road when this place was demolished. Next you can just see the edge of Len Watts, who had a shoe repair shop. Following on down Castle Street from Len Watts is the entrance to Bartlett's Cottages. The shop on the other side was a dress shop. It was run by Mrs. Goodchild, though I believe she moved out a long time before this picture was taken. However, her neighbour, Trustrom's, the grocer's, was well known. Next was Young's, the rope and tent manufacturers. Beside them is the entrance to Pine Court and Stafford Terrace. The last building before the clearance is Avery, the scale people. Now, all of that is gone. Looking up Castle Hill from this position, we can see the south side. This side of Castle Street looked like this in 1967. Haddock's, the builders, was on the corner of Coley Street. That's a road that's been swallowed up by the development. Further up is the Kennet Arms, one of the many pubs that also disappeared. Beyond that, you can just see Reading Garage's second-hand car depot. Now, let's look at the other side of Castle Street and see how that's changed. Here it is all cleared down, right from 96, which was Avery's building, down to Great Passage. The other side of Great Passage is the famous landmark of Vincent's. If I remember rightly, they started here, then they moved away to the station, coming back here afterwards. 2 doors down, you can just see Mitchell's, the confectioners. Now, standing here at the junction of Coley Street, we can look down at all these buildings. They were all still there, right down to the church. This was in September 1967. Turning right, we can now look down Coley Street before it completely disappears. On the left is the Salvation Army Hospital. That was built some time before. But gone is the Rose and Crown and the Blue Lion. Here's a last look at those pubs, which were the hub of Old Coley.
We now carry on the tour by going back up Castle Street to the junction of Field Road, with a detailed explanation of the area from my friend and colleague, Mr. Joe Doak.
We turn off Castle Hill into Field Road. Tomkins' map of 1802 shows that most of Coley was then outside the boundary of the town, with local chalk deposits being used for making lime to bleach cloth. The old fortifications to the left of the map are the remnants of the Civil War defences that ran through this area. It has been estimated by local historian Sarah Griffin that they were as tall as a double-decker bus. As we will see later, they still leave a mark on this area. Little Coley Farm buildings are located where St Saviour's Church is now. Soon after this map was drawn, the farm buildings became Coley Pottery. This map from 1875 shows the route of the road that was to become Field Road later. The only house in Field Road at this time is what is known as the White House, which is shown in light blue. The houses just to the northeast of the White House, shown in yellow, were said to be a conversion of an old Tudor building on the site called Commercial Hall. Gordon Spring, who worked in Reading Council Surveyors Department from 1923 until 1967, recounts a story that Commercial Hall was built to check and weigh wool that came into Reading on small barges from West Berkshire along the Kennet and Holybrook waterways. He was told that the original building was made of flint with an ecclesiastical appearance with stone tracery windows. Between 1810 and 1840, intensive brick and pottery production took place at Coley Pottery and also at Castle Hill Kiln, which was located further up Field Road. Use was made of the local chalk deposits to help fire the bricks. The purest chalk was deep mined from under Field Road. Castle Hill Kiln was operated by James Elisha, Sr., and then by his son until 1848, when Samuel Collier took on the lease. Collier also ran the adjoining Avenue Works, which covered what is now Boston Avenue, Holybrook Road, and most of Coley Wreck. Coley Pottery and Castle Hill Kiln ceased operating in the middle of the 19th century, and the site was eventually redeveloped from about 1875, when the southern part of Field Road, Garnet Hill and Dover Street were laid out and houses were constructed. This photo shows the first phase of development at the south end of Field Road, which was then called Western Street. St Saviour's Church has now been built at the south end of Field Road, on the site of Coley Pottery, along with St Saviour's Terrace and Church Terrace. Houses have also been built further up Field Road on the site of the old Castle Kiln and the deep chalk mine workings around it. Here we are in 1910, when the terrace of houses in the northern half of Field Road have been added, built around the turn of the century. Their pattern brick frontages led them to being included in the Russell Street and Castle Hill Conservation Area when it was designated in 1974. Sitting in the back gardens of the terrace is a prominent mound that is almost certainly part of the old Civil War fortifications. Here's some photos of Field Road in about 1915 to show what it looked like then. The implications of all that chalk mining that took place during the early Victorian period have come back to bite Field Road residents over the years. Although this headline is from the year 2000, the street has suffered subsidence on and off since the 1930s. These photos show the subsidence and demolition that took place between 1950 and 1980. The latest and thankfully last incident began on the 4th of January 2000, when a hole appeared in the front garden of number 6 Field Road. This quickly expanded to affect the whole road and areas beyond. Once the consultant engineers working for Reading Borough Council had surveyed the area, the extent of the Victorian chalk mines became apparent. They are shown in green on this plan. About £12 million of EU and UK government money was spent on ground stabilisation in the area. Field Road is now the safest street to live in Reading. This video snippet shows the junction of Field Road and Garnet Hill today.
We now come round to Garnet Street, and one of the pinnacle shops in my memories from the 50s and 60s is Jerry Allerton's Fish and Chips on the left hand corner of this picture. He was a very kind man, and I remember in my childhood he sold me some chips and crackling for 2D in old money. It was brilliant. On the left of Garnet Street we have a friend of mine, Marcia Tegg's house, who lived there in the 60s. I worked with her father, Jim Hughes, at Morris Garages. He was a great man and friend. The camera now swings round to the bottom of Dover Street. This is where my good friend Colin Hawkins used to live with his sister Lynn. I used to work with him at Morris Garages. He was apprenticed to Arthur Goodenough, working on Van der Pla 4-litre R's with Rolls-Royce engines. Houses lined both sides of this street, and on the right-hand corner lived the Fowler family. The youngest girl could do somersaults on the right-hand rails on the side of the hill. Now to the famous Stony Hill, as it was known. In the history it could have been the entrance to the chalk mine. However, in the late 50s we used to go down this hill on go-karts with spotters at the junction of Wolsey Street to make sure no traffic came along. The aim was to get as far as the Holy Brook in Brook Street West. We also played the same game in this picture, but it was just a question of sliding down the hill on a homemade sledge. And from this image you can see how steep the hill is, and definitely looks like a mine entrance. On the left-hand corner lived my aunt and uncle with my cousin Janet Jewell. The living quarters were in the basement, and the entrance was through the gateway on the side of the hill. The whole family spent lots of lovely Christmas parties there. Accessing it was slippery in the snow, but my Uncle Ken usually cleared the snow before we got there. Next to the house lived the Sayers family, and at the end of the row of terrace houses was the famous hole in the wall. This map, taken from 1932, shows the densely populated area of the Coley Courts, which stretches from the west of Coley Place to the west of Wolsey Street. People from the surrounding area segregated themselves from the people of the Coley Courts because of the fear of catching a contagious disease or illness, such as diphtheria, cholera, or scarlet fever. In this picture we can see how the road is now, but in the next picture I have recreated a scene from the 1950s showing the famous hole in the wall with the track leading to it. At that time Coley Place was only a tarmac road from Castle Street to the end of the houses you can see in the pictures of the Coley steps. It then went into a dirt-ridden pathway up to the hole in the wall. In my early days this entire area was a wasteland that the camera is now filming and has been replaced by these apartments. The next photo was taken in World War II, showing the construction of the air raid shelters behind Coley School and the missing houses of Castle Hill Place on the slope, also part of the Coley Courts. The interesting part of this image is the top right hand corner. It just shows part of the hole in the wall and its immense size. We now come onto the east side of Coley Place, and I need to take you back to the 1950s and 60s before any of these trees were planted. In this photo you can see Castle Street in the distance, and to the left would have been Mr. Lawrence's coal yard. To the right again you can see the 3 Dutch houses. Now let's take a look behind those trees. We can now see the 4-roomed air raid shelter with linking corridor where we played hide and seek and war games. The rooms 1 and 4 had a hole knocked in the back for reasons unknown. We now look at this picture courtesy of Callum Cromwell, showing the front of the shelter and the entrance. Just to the right there was a blast wall protecting the access to the corridor. The childhood dare was to step across the gap from the flat roof on the shelter to the top of the blast wall. The frightening thing was, if you missed your footing, there was a 3-metre drop onto brick rubble on the other side. Moving on, we have this cutaway, which is the back entrance to Morris Garage's workshop. The concrete pathway you can see here. Looking at the left of the photo, there is a steep hill called Danger, which went down to the old Francis Waldron's Mission Hall at the level of the cars shown in the picture. The memories I have of sliding down this hill on sheets of corrugated tin bent up at the ends to put your feet in, similar to the mats on a helter-skelter. The trouble was the tin had rust holes in it, and my friend Keith Evans and I frequently went home with holes in our trousers to the anger of our parents. In the centre you can see Tunbridge Jones Garages and the conker tree behind it by the Holy Brook. To the right of the image are the 2 pubs, namely the Blue Lion and behind it the Borough Arms. This photo shows Coley Street with the Salvation Army hostel in the background. If you look to the right of the building where the access road goes, that would have been the location of the British Workmen's Cafe and the Coley Boys Club before its demolition. If you look to the left of the picture, you can see the Rose and Crown Public House. In front of the pub is the entrance to the bottom yard of Morris Garages. The wall you can see on the left side of the picture by the fence is the back wall of the Mission. They put glass on top and embedded it in concrete to stop people climbing over. This photo, taken in the 60s, shows the start of the IDR. The Blue Line Public House is now gone, but the interesting aspect of the photo is the remains of the tarmac path of the Coley Passage, leading to the Coley Steps on the bottom right of the picture. In this image taken from the top of Coley Steps, it shows the arch where children would meet and play in wet weather, much to the annoyance of the lady living in the house on the left. It was one of only 3 entrances to the Coley Courts and shows the Blue Line and St Giles Church in perfect alignment. This photo shows the last remaining house of the courts that has been demolished in 1932. On the far left you can see the end of the back gardens of Coley Place and the area at the bottom of the hill behind Coley School, which is in the picture of the erection of the air raid shelters.
Looking at how the area around the Coley Steps developed, we can see that in 1802 it was relatively sparsely populated. The forthcoming book on Coley by Margaret Annesley points out that in 1783 the clerk of St Mary's Parish undertook a census of households, and this listed 24 households living in Pigney's Lane, which was later called Coley Street. This added up to about 125 people. The key person who opened up the Coley area to development was Thomas Bradford, who bought Coley Farm in 1802 and sold the northern part of it to Francis Lovelock and Thomas Tanner, who then sold it on quickly to various builders. One of the main builders was James Elisha, who also owned and operated Castle Brick Kiln, which we mentioned in part 1 of our history of Coley streets. Between 1802 and 1840, most of the terraces and court housing between Coley Place and Coley Street were built, increasing the population to just over 1,000 persons. This map from 1879 shows that housing has now been developed as far as the end of Wolsey Street, then called Brickfield Terrace, and along Coley Place to Dover Street. Various educational, religious and social facilities have been added in between the housing. These include the Workmen's Hall, the original St Saviour's Church, called the Iron Church, and the new Coley School, which was built in 1872. However, there are still parts of Coley which lay undeveloped, such as north of Willow Street, the east side of Brickfield Terrace, and south of the school, around and beyond Garnet Street. By the end of the century, development had spread to most parts of Old Coley, right down to St Saviour's Church, which was completed in 1888 as a replacement for the Iron Church. There were also a number of pubs that provided for the needs of the growing population. This map shows the pubs that have existed in Coley over the years, although only the Horse and Jockey, now called the Castle Tap, still exists. I've drawn them on a 1960s Ordnance Survey base map. Jumping forward to the 1930s, we can see that Berkeley Avenue is now connecting Coley to Catesgrove. The River Kennet was bridged in 1909 and Berkeley Avenue was joined up with Pell Street, later to become part of the A4 running through Reading. After many years of campaigning by local politicians and critical official reports, the slum housing around the Coley Steps was eventually demolished in the 1930s. This map shows that process just beginning. The clearances were completed by the beginning of the Second World War. This map from the 1950s shows the cleared sites as vacant land, with only a few houses on Coley Place remaining at the top of the Coley Steps. Vincent's Garage has now occupied some of that spare land, whilst further clearance has occurred along Coley Place, and council flats are in the process of being built to replace those houses. This is the decade well remembered by Graham and other members of the Coley Facebook group, so I'll leave it to Graham to talk about life during those years. The final big event that impacted on the core of Old Coley was the construction of the IDR, which smashed its way through the area. It took out a number of streets and was the final death knell of the Coley Steps, as earthworks engulfed the valley side and replaced the steps with a pedestrian footbridge over the IDR. Finally, we can show the most up-to-date map of the area from 2020. As Graham and myself have found, the Coley Steps is now an elusive entity. It remains only as an image in the mental maps of old Coleyites or in the archives of the Berkshire Records Office.
We now start part 2 of our tour, again at the houses and people of the Coley Steps, with a look at what it was like now to what it was like in the early 1900s, with the final demolition taking place in 1932. We look at this video clip with the saying in mind, England's green and pleasant land, not realising the amount of people living here and the squalid conditions they endured. Joe Doak and I have tried to locate the position of the steps which we were told had not been removed by Reading Borough Council. They had only been covered over with earth during the construction of the footbridge. This is ourselves on an exploratory mission trying to locate the exact position, but to no avail. The houses in these pictures are of the back-to-back type, built around 1832 for the brickfield workers. They stood approximately 100 years. The living conditions were worse than a third world country. A number of houses had only a single room upstairs and a living room downstairs, which did everything from cooking to washing. There was no main drainage, only a cesspit for the disposal of human waste, and there was a reluctance on cost to empty them by the owners of the courts, so most of them overflowed into the passageways. The houses had no gas, electricity, and heating was done by a coal-fire range, with lighting being achieved by the use of candles. The houses were so close that pollution was so intense you could hardly breathe, and on some passageways you could put your hand out of the bedroom window and shake hands with the person in the opposite house. The washing of clothes was achieved in a communal outhouse shared by 6 families or more, and fresh water was acquired from a standpipe in the passageway, also shared by a number of families. Rats and cockroaches were rife in the courts, and with it brought disease. Epidemics of scarlet fever, cholera, measles, diphtheria were very frequent for the area, and calling of the school register was used to locate areas with absenteeism, helping the health authority remedy the problem. I will finish here as this is a subject on its own. The only comment to make is that people living here were made of really strong stuff to withstand the hardship they endured. This picture shows the sad remains of the Coley steps before the bulldozers moved in to build the IDR. Mr. Lawrence's house is in the background and his coal yard is to the right-hand side. We now view the photo of Coley Street in the late 60s, showing the start of the building works for the IDR. In early times, on the left of the photo, it was the site of Bossier and Marshall Square, but now it is the commercial workshop for Morris Garages. We then have the Rose and Crown Public House, and to the right is Holybrook House and Haddock's, the builder's offices. We now have an image of the demolition of those offices and the work starting on the IDR. The next photo shows the children of the Maslin family. They are halfway up Coley Street and it shows the houses intact with the entrance to Great Passage at the back going through to Hosier Street. In this photo you can see the same view as it is now, but such a drastic change. We now start again at the top of the hill at the junction with Castle Street and look back down Coley Street towards the Blue Line on the left. We can now see the start of Wolsey Street with Mr. Bristow's shop in the centre, and to the right we have the Rose and Crown pub, and you can see how the pollution at that time has affected the brickwork. My grandmother's house was next to the pub on the right. It was a Jewell family. To the left you would have seen this photo fit image of the Coley Working Man's Cafe and the Coley Boys Club. But in the next image it is the start of the IDR and what it is like now, showing a road that has caused the destruction of Coley and originally went to nowhere, with a footbridge that cost a great deal of money and little purpose. We now continue our tour of Wolsey Street with this early photo of the Blue Lion pub. It must be early as the word blue is spelt with a V instead of a U. Looking south to the left we start with what was Mr. Bristow's shop, and to the right we have Coley School. The first image is Mr. Bristow himself standing outside his shop. This was a favourite shop of the children for buying sweets on their way to and from school. There was a back entrance to the shop from Brook Street West, which people would use to do their shopping. This was a photo of the shop in the early 70s. As you can see, the shop is now Somerville Glazing Company. They also had a small factory halfway down on the left, opposite the school. The next photo from a different angle in Coley Street shows a complete row of terraced houses on the east side of Wolsey Street. The spare ground on the right has now been fenced off, and what's left of the area which is not fenced off is a car park for these old vehicles. In this image we can see the west side of Wolsey Street minus the Brickmakers Arms, which was run by the Rex family. The back gardens can be seen in the photos of the Coley School playground. This image shows one of the many pub outings to the coast, this one being the Brickmakers Arms organised by the landlord. The next photo shows Diane Griffin as a young girl standing in Wolsey Street. The row of houses directly behind her back onto Poplar Court. Then further on you can see the stables of Champ's Sweet Shop, then Brasini's grocery shop on the corner of Coley Street and Willow Street, and finally on the right of the picture again the Blue Lion. The next photo is from the VE Day celebrations of 1945, and we have a voice recording of the occasion from Mrs. Diane Rayburn, whose maiden name was Griffin, a child at the time.
Yeah, well, as I say, everybody in the street, you know, they were all wanted to organise and hung banners from the windows, but my dad still being in the China Seas, and Japan hadn't surrendered at that point, and she said, no, I'm not doing any celebrating, not till he's home, and that's it, and I know he's not in danger anymore. I think she probably went outside and poked her nose. My gran would have been at work. My mother, Granny Gaines, worked all the time. She never even took holidays. In the class I was in at Coley, I can reel off names of kids whose fathers were killed in the war. There was Bernie Beach, there was Veronica Pike, Pat Plumridge. That's just 3 of the children in my class whose fathers had died. Veronica Pike, she lived just a bit further down there at Burt Bristow's, and her dad, Italy, I think he would have landed in Italy, and he was killed before she was even born. Her mum was pregnant with him. My mum said she can remember everybody shocked because she was pregnant, and that she just had the telegram that her husband had been killed.
The next image shows the 1953 coronation of Queen Elizabeth, a different atmosphere from the previous photo. In this picture, it shows the most southerly part of Wolsey Street and illustrates the various street traders that came round, like the Coleman, Muffin Man and Ice Cream Man. This photo shows another outing organised by St Saviour's Church. I can remember the excitement of any day trip to the coast as people could not afford cars. It was always a long journey with a rest halfway down at the tea rooms by Petersfield railway station. The last photo shows the Garnet Street World War II celebrations with the 2 American soldiers at the front. I was at school with Donald Vickers, who lived on the left, with Patricia Mansfield, who lived next door. We have a voice recording by Nicky Rogers on the occasion, and here it is.
VE Day Celebration Photograph, Garnet Street, Reading, 1945. My father, Michael Millam, lived at number 8 Garnet Street with his mum and dad, Nancy and Frank, and his sister Margaret. Dad always told us that he thought that the VE Day street party was held for his birthday, which was on the 8th of May. He would have been 8 years old in 1945. Bernard Millam, my dad's cousin, who lived at 12 Garnet Street, recalled the day. He was 5 years old when the street party was held to celebrate VE Day. Some of the adults painted big V's on their brick walls in the street for victory. Bernard's sister recalls her mum and my nan cutting out and making bunting. They would sit at the front window of the house with the window open, and people would pass through the material which they made the bunting with on old treadle sewing machines. Bernard's mum Ivy and my nan Nancy and other mums in the street rustled up some lovely food for the party. All the kids were seated around long tables in the middle of the street. They all had a great time. He recalls that the Mayor of Reading and Mr McIlroy, the department store owner, were present. 2 wandering GIs, who are present at the front of the photograph, came along to see what was going on, and much to their surprise they were invited to sit down and have a cup of tea. It is thought that they were from Greenham or Aldermaster military bases. After everyone had finished eating, they lit a bonfire in the middle of the road and burnt a guy they had made with a likeness to Hitler, and everyone cheered as it burned. Mrs Parsons, the owner of the corner shop, brought some fireworks, which they then lit as well. Bernard's mum Ivy played that upright piano which they had taken out onto the pavement, playing war tunes like We'll Meet Again in her usual Les Dawson manner. David Chard, another Garnet Street resident at that time, remembered it as being a very special day.
We now have an historical video clip from my friend and colleague, Mr Joe Doak.
This section of the tour covers the historical development of the areas of Coley next to the River Kennet. This first map from 1879 shows the early development of housing on the east side of the Holybrook, which took place in the 1850s. Just south of the housing in Brook Street and Lower Brook Street was land owned by Reading Iron Works. The Iron Works was established by 3 partners, George Barrett, William Exall and Charles Andrews. It grew to be one of the top 3 agricultural engineering companies in Britain, employing over 400 people. William Exall was a very innovative engineer, and he helped design and build the cutting-edge equipment that allowed Huntley and Palmer to become the largest biscuit manufacturer in the world. However, poor commercial awareness and mismanagement led to significant problems, and the company went into liquidation in 1887. By the time the ironworks closed, further housing development had taken place in the streets to the north. Willard Street had been built out, and Henrietta, Bright and Parnell Streets had been added. Some housing had also been built next to the River Kennet at Temple Place, just down from Bear Wharf. Temple Place presumably got its name from the nearby Salvation Army Temple in Willow Street, which was built in 1881. Here's a pan of the old ironworks, Lower Brook Street and Temple Place as it is today. In 1908, the Coley branch line was built to service Simmons Brewery and other industries in this part of Reading. The central goods depot was built by the Great Western Railway on the land formerly occupied by the ironworks, and the Salvation Army Temple was incorporated into the depot. The branch line closed in July 1983, and the goods depot, along with part of the line, has been reused for the A33 relief road, coming down into central Reading from the M4 motorway. North of this area was the site of the Bridge Street Brewery, owned and managed for most of its life by the Simmons family. Their production of beer contributed one of the 3 Bs to the town's industrial history. Simmons started in Broad Street, but relocated to Bridge Street in 1785, establishing the brewery on a site now occupied by part of the Oracle Shopping Centre. From about 1890, Simmons expanded along Fobney Street into Coley. Many local residents found employment in the brewery. Simmons employed cutting-edge science and technology to create and store their beers. They supplied the British Army, serviced thirsty customers on the National Rail network, and expanded to become one of the biggest brewers in southern England. In 1960, the brewery was taken over by Courage, and in 1979 it closed operations on Bridge Street and moved out to Wharton Grange near the M4. Despite being a modern and well-located plant, Wharton Grange was closed down in 2010. A few of the old brewery buildings survive, including one malt house and part of the stable block on Fobney Street. A remnant of the Coley branch line is also evident next to the converted malt house.
We start the third and final tour of Coley Streets at the junction of Wolseley Street and Willow Street, as shown in this image. The memory I have is my father telling me of the German bomber machine gunning up Willow Street from the River Kennet, and the bullets ricocheting off the road with him having to take cover behind Tunbridge Jones' garage wall on the left. He was trying to get to his mother's house in Brook Street to make sure she was okay. When he arrived, she was standing in the back garden waving a frying pan at the plane. He brought her into the house to take cover. Apparently one of the bullets went into the stables by Great Passage and killed a horse. The last building by the man on the left is Mr. Shipton's garage, who owned the corner shop just past the tree. If you look closely at the wall of the garage on the left, at the bottom you can see how badly the brickwork is crumbling. And I tend to think that this building is part of the old Union Workhouse, later adapted as shops in the early 1900s. On the right hand side you can see the Blue Lion Public House. The pub was a meeting place for social activities, and crowds would gather at this road junction on November the 5th to view the bonfire celebrations on the spare ground, now the Coley School car park. On one occasion some bright spark dragged a flaming car tire off the bonfire to the Coley steps and let it roll down into the crowd. Fortunately everyone got out of the way and it hit the doors of the pub. If you look to the right, just past the blue line, you can see a hedge. Set back behind this hedge was a little cottage with church-type windows. Moving on, you can see the bridge over the Holy Brook and the Borough Arms pub, run by Alice Wicks, with the help of David Bryant from Wolseley Street. On the left-hand side, you can see the famous conker tree, which had a large rope tied to it, and we used to swing out over the river. There was the knack into the way you would swing out so as to get back to the bank. Many of the girls and boys using it fell in the river and went home soaking wet. The tree was situated on the corner with Henrietta Street, and on the opposite corner was Mr. Shipton's shop, which you can see in this image. This photo shows Willow Street as it is now. The Simmons maltings are just out of sight of the picture on the left. We now move to the bottom of Willow Street, and I will pass you over to the late Doug Noyes for his explanation of this end of the street.
To March 1969, with the entrance in front to the old Central Goods Station. As seen in July 1967, the north side of Willow Street. This looks as it had done for years. But what are the people who lived here? There was Sawyer at number 13, Miss Mary Richardson at the shop, number 17, Stacy at 21, and Gibbons at 23. Then, much earlier, Mrs. Nugent rang the caff at number 35. The winter of 69-70 saw the bridging of the Holy Brook. This is near where the Borough Arms stood. At the same time, the supports for the footbridge were in place. Transformation of Coley was well on the way. By August 72, the bridge was finished. Yet in the distance, Part of old Coley still stands. Let's go to the end of the bridge for a closer look. Here is part of Henrietta Street. The nameplate is on the side of the end house in Willow Street. Behind this is the demolition of Bright Street. And in the distance, the bridge of the IDR crosses a Kennet. Watch this as we update this area. June 73. The old houses of Coley have been replaced by prefabs until it's redeveloped to become the Holybrook site. The road surface of Willow Street still remains.
This photo shows a street party in Bright Street and outlines the north side of the row of terraced houses. I was born 3 years after this photo was taken and spent my childhood at number 7, halfway along on the left-hand side of the picture, and I can still remember the stories of the VE Day celebrations. The Simmons Maltings building at the back still remains there today and was used in the beer making process. Heat supplied from a furnace at the bottom of the building filtered through a hollow floor to the grain in the top. The bunting was handmade from old clothes and worn out bed sheets, and stitching it all together was carried out using an old treadle Singer sewing machine brought into the street from the surrounding houses. It should be remembered that clothing and food would still be on ration, so the food on the table would have been a collective effort for the children's party. The tables and chairs were brought outside into the street from the surrounding houses. The children's party would go on most of the day with various games such as apple bobbing. Then in the evening the adults would get together for music and dancing, with a bonfire lit at the junction of Parnell Street. The burnt outline in the tarmac remained until the construction of the IDR. We now look at this view of Bright Street during the 1953 Queen Elizabeth coronation, and I think there was a competition for the best dressed street, which gave a different atmosphere from the VE Day celebrations. This image shows the family members of the street walking towards the camera. The 2 children playing the trumpet are Geoffrey Weller and the famous Derek Watkins, and in the centre of them is Terry Bradfield on the euphonium. I am the 3rd child in from the left by the side of the trumpet player. The second man in from the right is my father. This image was taken about 1967 and shows the north side of Bright Street, and my friend Keith Evans' house is the second one in from the far end. The Ford Anglia in the photo is mine, outside my house at number 7 Bright Street. This photo shows the south corner of Bright Street, and the house second from the end belonged to the Weller family. It also shows Simmons' horse-drawn wagon behind the railings of the Maltings. Here we have another picture of the street taken standing in the corner looking westwards towards the Holybrook River and the Salvation Army Hostel. This image shows another full picture of Parnell Street looking north. The 2 streets had 3 gas lamps in them altogether, and I remember the lamplighter coming round in the morning and evening to turn them on and off. We now move west along Willow Street to Brook Street, and we see this picture of the Borough Arms standing on the corner. Looking behind the pub you can see the chimneys of the Maltings, one of them still standing today, and to the left you can see the famous Conker tree again. To the right you can just see Mrs. Shipton's shop standing on the corner of Henrietta Street, and in the middle the backs of the houses on the south side of Bright Street. This image was taken during the Queen's coronation at the southern end of Brook Street looking north, and I think the lady with her back to us was Mrs. Roberts. We now look at this image of the river. It shows Temple Place being behind the telegraph pole on the left, and the turn into Lower Brook Street is just behind the lady on the bank. The Eastern printing press is on the right-hand side, and the black building behind the man's head stood on the boat is Baines Timber Merchants opposite the maltings. The cottage in front of them on the left is Jock Hunter's cottage, who was the foreman of the building. I do not know what this occasion was. This is a close-up photo of Jock Hunter's cottage that was seen in the previous image. It stands on the corner of Willow and Fobney Street. That can be seen also in the next aerial picture. This photo is an aerial view of the layout of Old Coley by the west side of the River Kennet from the 1950s. In the bottom centre of the image is the Coley goods depot. It shows the railway line layout into the Maltings and Baines Timber Yard. The houses in Willow Street, Bright Street and Parnell Street can be seen now, as well as the cottage by the Maltings and the coal yard manager's house, Mr. Burton, on the right hand side. Quite an in-depth photo. We now move left to the Holy Brook. To see this in a very sorry state, and as I stand watching it, I look back into my childhood and remember this area as a major source of entertainment. People would meet on the summer's evening and stand talking by the river. Men and boys would be fishing with bread or maggots bought from Wires the fishing tackle shop in Southampton Street. Little children would catch sticklebats and minnows with jam jars tied with string or fishing nets. It was completely safe, as there were hardly any cars at that time, and the railings prevented them from falling in the river. We also looked after the stream, cutting back the reeds and clearing any major rubbish, and we would catch our fishing hooks on. The usual pastime was to build rafts from old doors taken from derelict buildings and strap empty oil drums to them from Hewing's garages. Or we would build canvas kayaks with plans bought from Sleep's model shop in King's Road. To paddle up the river you had to be careful though, because as it was made of canvas it could easily be punctured. The other craft that was on the river was bomb boats. One I think was owned by Eric Roberts, and they looked like fuel tanks from aircraft. The bottom was filled with house bricks to give them stability. I mentioned them to my Aunt Margaret, who was known to the residents of Brook Street as Peggy Harris. She told me that I was correct. They were fuel tanks from damaged aircraft, doing bombing raids over Germany in the Second World War. They would be jettisoned over Bucknell's Fields before flying into Woodley Aerodrome, hopefully for a safe landing. Finally, we have arrived at Brook Street West with this photo. It shows the full length of the street, and if you look towards the far end you can see the back entrance to Penta Body Centre crash repair specialists. The gap between the houses are the back entrances to the homes in Wolseley Street. One of them was Mr. Bristow's shop. The people would use the rear entrance as a shortcut to gain access to the store, to save them walking the long way round Wolseley Street. This picture shows Mr. and Mrs. Bristow with their daughter Jenny, but I do not recognise the other lady. Behind them is my grandfather and grandmother's house in Brook Street, with the Borough Arms again in the picture. We now come to the end and final video of the tour of Coley Streets. I hope it gave an insight into the people and places of Coley's past. We have created all 3 videos as a memory for people of the Coley area and the future inhabitants. Thank you for watching.